Got it. Okay, we got a lot to cover today. So I'm thinking we just go ahead and jump straight in. We are going to have just a brief opportunity for updates from the board members, and specifically stuff around Shutter Creek and the legislation. And then, this is really a continuation of some of the discussions from the board retreat, in which we were really talking in part about, among other things, financial viability and
recording in progress.
sorry. Yeah. Good. I'll just come back. Okay.
Fred, I think you'll need to turn the volume down on your computer as well.
It's working on it.
Yeah, I'm just gonna rejoin without joining the audio at all. I just want to be able to share my screen when the time came, if needed.
So it is really about the balancing here between the financial viability questions and some of the conservation commitments and some of the stuff around buffers and ecological or extensive forestry. So the team has been working overtime, including some of the prospective board members, to try to come up with options. And honestly, well, I'll save that. I'm going to finish the agenda and then we'll get into the content. We'll wrap up that around 1:15. We'll have about 10 minutes for public comment. If you're a member of the public and wish to say something to the board, feel free to shoot me a chat, and we'll try to track and keep a list. You can also send that to Jenna, and we'll wrap up and get you on to your days by 1:30. Any questions about the agenda? All right. Want to do legislative and Shutter Creek updates?
Sure. Morning, everybody. This is Brett Brownstone with DSL, and I think I'll invite Bill or Vicky. I'm going to pull up all the meeting participants, figure out who's all here. I think real quick though, legislative updates. So Senate Bill 161 with the -3 amendment that would move the deadline for the enabling actions prior to the January 1 authorization of an Elliott State Research Forest and the board authority. That December 31 date is moving forward in the -3 amendments on the House side of the legislature. And there was a hearing last week that went well. And thank you all for just quick responses and engaging around your individual feedback on the letter that you sent to Vicky, to Director Walker. She included that letter with her testimony, and then thank you as well to OSU who testified. It feels like, and I'll pause with maybe Bill, ask you to channel what you're hearing from Chris Castelli, our legislative coordinator. I think there's a work session on the bill next week, believe, or on May 9th, I believe. Is that right, Bill?
I think that's right, yes.
Okay, so work session will happen on that bill. Legislative timelines are moving forward. And I think the key watch out points are making sure the bill's moving forward according to the legislative timelines. And if there's a walkout in the legislature this year, that could be a major stumbling block to getting the bill passed, because it would have to, when passed in the House, go back to the Senate side for concurrence and then get signed by the governor prior to the July 1 date. It's in Senate Bill 1546. So some moving pieces on it, but moving forward is the direction. And I don't know, Bill, if you had anything more to add on that, or Vicky.
I don't, other than just I did confirm that that work session is scheduled at the House Agricultural, Land Use, et cetera, committee on the 9th, starting at 3 o'clock.
Okay. And then other update, Shutter Creek is
Yeah.
yeah. So I guess a quick high level. General Services Administration is still working up the language around the deed transfer from that would move Shutter Creek into a facility managed for wildlife conservation purposes instead of a facility managed as a correctional institution. We haven't seen the language yet. When we do see the language, we'll be sure you all are seeing it and are aware. We're expecting to see something within a couple of weeks. And meanwhile, DSL's working on a yet unsigned but nearing signature interagency agreement with Department of Corrections around assuming the maintenance and security and related payment for contracts to basically keep Shutter Creek in a position to be further moved into kind of the revisioned purpose for Shutter Creek. And that includes, the purposes related to the Elliott State Research Forest Authority and having authority staff there, as well as partnerships, including with the Confederate Tribes of the Coos, Sayusla, around use of the site, as well as kind of broader interests in the site, use not just for the forestry department, but broader interest in the site. We had a really good visit in the rain, but beautiful and nice on the 20th of April with tribal council members and staff. And Colin, I don't know, I know you were in DC during that time. I don't know if you have anything on that, but Vicki has reached back out to the tribal council for a time to kind of debrief that visit and continue the conversations there. Meanwhile, we're also working on ensuring through memo language with GSA that the cell tower on the site is secured and not going anywhere, and the purposes of that cell tower related to emergency communications up and down the coast, and other interests the cell tower serves is kept certain while the deed language changes. So yeah, I don't know, Vicki or Colin, if you have anything to add on that, but that's a high level update on Shutter Creek. And at the same time, we're moving forward with the federal $4 million grant and moving the spending of that money into the maintenance and security work, but also the bigger plan for revisioning. And so much more to come on Shutter Creek, and feels like there's a lot on the windshield right now. And I think as we work through the subject matter of the meeting today, we'll have future meeting conversations related to Shutter Creek, and also things around federal appropriations asks related to Shutter Creek and larger budget conversations. So yeah, Paul's got his hand up, but Vicki, Colin, do you have any? Feel free to jump in if there's anything that I may have missed.
Wow.
Oh, go ahead, Vicki.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm delayed. I'm gonna be in and out today. We have budget issues because our budget is up on Thursday. So I'm just gonna be in and out. That's all I have to say at this point. Plus, I got a COVID booster yesterday, and the pharmacist told me I'd be sick one day, and he's exactly right. So anyway, I think, Brett, the gist of what I heard is you were telling about our trip to Shutter Creek with the tribe, which was all accurate. And I also visited with the tribal council on the site about the letter they had sent to me. And I don't know if we're going to discuss that now or later in the meeting. So you'll need
Is that
to.
next, Peter, or what do you want to?
If you want to raise it now, I mean, there are components of that are also a part of the content that will be discussed later as well. So, but
Why don't we hit it after we tie off the Shutter Creek up.
Yeah, that sounds great.
That's fine. So Brett was correct. We walked around with various members of the tribal council, the chief and the chair were there and other members. And so yesterday I sent them an email. I was asked to send an email so that we could schedule another Zoom meeting to discuss what they observed as we walked around the site. They were making notes. We had given them a diagram of Shutter Creek and talked a bit. And so I'll be meeting with the tribal council about that, as well as to further discuss their letter that I received on that day and had not reviewed prior to my meeting with them at Shutter Creek. But I did chat with them, and so we'll talk about that later. Okay.
Paul?
Yeah, I'm just curious, there's at least 3 different entities we're talking about using Shutter Creek. Who's it going to be transferred to?
The
Is it-
Department of State Lands.
So, okay, so not the authority, the DSL.
Correct. At
Yeah,
least
and
for-
then initially,
at least for
Paul,
now.
I think, and that's the question down the road, given that we can't have it transferred to the authority now because it doesn't exist. In, legally.
Yeah,
But that opportunity or that possibility is not foreclosed because of this. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And that's actually one of the issues I'm working with our budget analyst on this morning. So yeah, for now, Paul, it's going to be in DSL's hands unless we turn it back in August.
okay.
Vicky, do you want to tee up now the letter, and Colin, I'll certainly give you a chance to speak to that as well.
Yeah, sure. Well, the letter basically reiterates some of what, most of what Colin discussed in his letter that went out to the Prospective board. And, I want to acknowledge that the tribe has been very thoughtful about their concerns. And I appreciate Chair Nieper taking that time. What I did tell them, we have been intentional about tribal engagement from the get-go. I have had several consultations with the CT Klutzi. I've offered those consultations to other tribes as well. And no other tribe has been asking for that. The Coquel assured me that if they have a need to consult, they will reach out to me. So I'm good with that. But I guess we're committed to always tribal engagement, and we've had tribal representation on the advisory committee and on the Prospective board. And we got agreement from everyone about the direction we were headed. So some of the suggested changes, and I shared this with Chair Nieper and the tribal council at the Shutter Creek. Some of those changes I think are doable, and we can have conversations about those. But I made it pretty clear that we can't start over. There is just absolutely no way we can go back and start over and completely redo the research design. We're too far into it. We've spent a lot of money and time getting to that. So I think there are other things that we can work with. I have some thoughts that I've been sharing with Brett, and I want to talk more with the tribal council about it. I just want to be clear that we can't scrap the fundamentals of where we're at today. We have a research forest platform on the table. The land board has agreed to where we are. The Prospective board agrees with where we're at, and there just has to continue to be collaboration and compromise to remain true to the spirit of this endeavor. So that's I just gave the tribe a heads up in that meeting, and And so we'll continue those conversations. And of course, Colin is on this board representing a tribal interest. He works for the tribe, he works for CT Klutzy, and certainly is free to express his opinion about the tribal interests, and that's what we expect from every board member. You're not here, as I want to remind people though, you're not here representing your specific interests so much as you're a board member representing your position on the board. However, on the tribal end of things, tribes are not stakeholders. I think we're all quite aware of that. They're sovereign governments. That is why I continue to engage with the CT Klutzy and the Tribal Council on a government to government relationship, so that we can continue to have conversations. And that's sort of where I sit at the moment with the letter. And I'll throw it back to you, Peter, unless someone has questions.
Well, let me first see, Colin, if there's anything you wanted to say, and then Paul, I see your hand, and then we'll see if any other prospective board members have comments or questions.
Yeah, I don't think I really have anything to add that's not in the letter that came from Tribal Council.
Okay, thanks, Colin. Paul?
I'm not in favor of scrapping what we've done and throwing 4 years away. But if what we've done doesn't work, there's not a hell of a lot of sense in continuing on the path that we're on, that a major adjustment may be necessary. One of the commitments we made was the finances. And I mean, scratch around and scratch and add the numbers up and divide and subtract. I don't see the finances there, and they're actually they're lower than I thought they were. So maybe not scrap, but I think we're going to be looking at a major adjustment.
Thanks, Paul. And some of that is the balancing and the discussion that I think we'll need to have with you all this, I don't know, in 10 minutes, beginning in 10 minutes. So anyone else reflections? All right, then I think we can just go ahead and jump into it. And I do want to just emphasize something that Vicky said as we go into the next portion of the agenda, in that one of the things I heard you all say during the retreat to one another was this idea of sort of problem solving and reiterating the question of how can we make this work as sort of one of the things that's going to guide your thinking going forward, and also the piece that Vicky said around functioning as a board. That's part and parcel of what I just said, but really trying to be true to yourselves as people and the things you value, but also trying to work towards speaking with a unified voice about what are really complicated and complex issues. A lot of people have been working on this for a long time, and it's been very difficult to get to this place. And there's been a lot of compromise to do that. And more may be necessary, and change may be necessary. That's for you all to decide, but I think it will be important for the board to speak, work to speak with a unified voice. And I encourage you to approach these next topics with sort of a problem solving intention, because there is no silver bullet. As difficult or as hard as people have been working on this, it's there's no easy answer. And so I think staff and the team are gonna need some guidance from the board in terms of direction moving forward. So with that, I'll be quiet and turn it over to Brett, Shannon, Melissa, and others.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Well, I'll kick it off, and what I'm going to be working from or speaking from or to is the change framework document that I sent a version yesterday and then a revised version, I guess technically not yesterday, but this morning in the wee hours. And so if you don't have it open, if you could open it up, it came in at, I think, 2:20 something AM as a PDF document. There were 4 other attachments that are map depictions and tables that are relevant to the financial viability, extensive and long rotation side of the conversation. But the first document in that email is the change framework. And I guess what I wanted to maybe first reflect is we came out of the board retreat with some high-level feedback and direction to those of us on staff, whether it's in the DSL or the OSU or the ICF chair, to come back with some analysis and some potential pathways for deepening potential direction around changes. And I guess when I think about changes or the change framework, I think about it in the context, I guess, one of like what's DSL's role in all of this fundamentally. And right now, there's a front and center, even with a December 31 timeline, a front and center timeline with HCP development that is ticking and urgent, and even with an extension to December 31 overall, it doesn't get a ton easier. And so with all deadlines, there's pressure, and there's pressure to keep things moving, and DSL is the applicant on the HCP. And so we need to get something into the services. The intent was to have that tied off at the end of April. So we're a bit over that already. And the intent is to try to tie off what changes look like at a little deeper than the conceptual level coming out of the board retreat today, to do that today. And then move it into the further analysis that would be done necessary for the mid-July transmittal of a list of changes or revisions to the HCP to the services. But that's just the HCP context, and that is a deadline that stresses me out because I'm tied to it. But the broader context for changes, I think, around the interests that are the pillars for that are called out in Senate Bill 1546 around this needs to be a research forest. The legislation calls it out as a world-class research forest. It needs to be self-sustaining, and it needs to have and that speaks to the financials as well as the research design, and it needs to have the conservation assurances in there relevant to getting an HCP to assure operability, but the larger conservation values die down such that this board, or what would become this board, can move forward with confidence into the implementation phase once July or January 1 hits. And so there's a lot in this change framework that kind of implicates your interests, and once you've got the legally authorized authority, where this thing's going to go. And as it's currently said, OSU as a management research contractor would be bringing forward biennial operations plans based on where this conversation lands. So with that, I guess there are 2 sides to this conversation, I guess. I don't know, I hate to break it down in that binary way, but there's it feels like the ability to reach agreed upon feedback for forward movement is where people land on that, probably, you know, the conversation about conservation protections for murrelet and the MRW and where that lands is probably directly relevant to where some of you feel flexibility or desire to land on the idea of financial viability changes related to the CRW, the MRW partials or elsewhere, and then vice versa. And so it's a bit of like, what do we try to tackle first? And so I think, Peter, like just the way I'm thinking about it is if we, as staff, and this would be kind of an effort of me, OSU staff team, and then I want to draw in Ryan at points and Melissa from ICF at points, but if we can present to you all, here's the feedback, here's the analysis that we've done, here's the feedback coming out of that board retreat. Do it both on the approach to the MRW murrelet conservation side, and what are the potential pathways there, and then on the harvest / financial viability option side, and then come to you all for how do you want this discussion to land, instead of asking for a check-in on that, first on the financials, then on the conservation MRW side, just let you.
Anybody have
in first?
Anybody have a concern with that approach? So you're going to hear the murrelet conservation stuff, you'll hear the financial and harvest stuff, and then we'll kind of take a collective conversation about the two components together. And while the discussion's happening, feel free to ask clarifying questions, but we'll try to keep it at a fairly high level for the overview. All right.
Okay. So I think I'll start with the conservation side, and I'm going to share the screen and then pull it down. But in the conservation MRW side, let me see here. Okay. I'll dive into it, and there's some detail that I'll get at that's not in this document, but I'll use this document as a framework. And then knowing that people's eyes get sore staring at a document, you all need to see each other when you talk, I'll pull it down. So there's stuff that you did with feedback at the board meeting on the 5th, or the board meeting on the 17th and 18th of April, that we're already moving forward. And so that's related to removing clear cuts from the murrelet occupied layer, and then revisions to the harvest cap. And so that's being moved forward both as part of the HCP and the FMP. This tier 2, I broke these changes, or the change framework, into different tiers. One that's already done, 2 that needs more conversation here. And these options are kind of they're not mutually exclusive. There could be some combining, pulling apart, but they're intended to be something with more specificity that drives forward on where we're going to land on this. And it's really important to land on something coming out of this meeting so that we can keep the HCP conversations going, and same with the translation to the FMP. So first, I wanted to say A and D. So the first option around this is knowing this is a difficult conversation, and it started with, okay, there were some felt there were buffers on the trimas in the MRW occupieds. There aren't. What are we going to do about it? The first option is the simplest way, which is in some ways easy on a timeline, but not necessarily the outcome that folks are asking for. But it's put a buffer on a select portion of the occupied habitat in the MRW of 150 feet applied to the outside of the occupied habitat in two specific bands of occupied murrelet trimas within the MRW. And that's not a yeah, I think what I have up here is, here's how many acres would be impacted by that, broken down by extensive and intensive. The idea would be have within the intensives, a no-cut buffer, and within the adjacency extensives, 60% retention buffer, and then an adaptive management provision to deviate from, this is the default approach, but with adaptive management to be able to deviate from it to different buffering strategies based on coordination with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and either on the ground conditions that would argue for different buffering or no buffering. For example, if there's already a hard edge between a proposed treatment stand and occupied habitat, then adding a buffer wouldn't make sense. So there would be some flexibility in this, but basic idea is this, and this is a short one because it potentially involves buffering acres that are not really, they're not part of the consolidated layer, which depicts what the known suitable habitat is within the MRW. And to some degree, those that have been asking for what are we going to do about the lack of buffers have not proposed this as the lead desired option. But to the extent there agreement can't exist around anything else, this is a simple approach and provides, I think, some degree of assurance that we'll get the HCP through. The last one, D, is use some temporal approaches to how take or impacts to potentially occupied habitat flow during the permit term. And so, it doesn't all happen at once in the analysis of what take happens and what take gets permitted under this HCP. There's a way to spread the effects over time decadally and then make sure that any take, there's a stay ahead provision related to making sure that improvement of habitat or acres of murrelet habitat are not being exceeded by the level of take in a given decade. So we're going to say D shortly because we're going to do it anyway. So the real conversation, it seems like, is if deviation from a simplistic approach is desired, there are two options that are sketched out in here. The first came out of the border treat, where I think between Bob and then Tom DeLuca, the concepts of a buffered or bucket of buffers that would then be applied, not all up front, but biennially, kind of retain the flexibility to work during the biennial operations planning process. Those concepts came forward, and so we're trying to work with that. And the bucket, there's a range around how many acres would be in the bucket. The bucket would exist across the life of the HCP. Not something that gets refreshed every biennium, but it's there to be drawn upon if needed to ensure the outcomes that are at the heart of the buffering conversation. And those are really how to protect existing interior habitat within older forests in the MRW from impacts of edge effect from extensive or intensive logging on the outside or within that habitat. So I think the other things to note on this one would be this range around the buffers is I've captured a range for your consideration, and I think we've moved this forward under the context of we need to discuss this, but The 902 acres is essentially drawn from, what would the amount of acreage be if you were to apply a 150-foot buffer to just the two bands of trimas that have been highlighted as of being of significant concern within the MRW. That's where the 902 exists. It's not the 300-foot buffer that I think corresponds to the Pacific Seabird Protocol and what exists in other HCPs, but it's something that the 150 does correspond to science around reduction of impacts reduction of impacts from predators. So the approach to how this bucket would be meted out would be in the extensives. You would look for areas that are of highest value to interior habitat protection. And that includes, and then for those areas, they'd be allocated to a higher retention, 60 and above for extensive management within these portions of extensive that sit between already existing occupied polygons. And we could show some of that on a map to depict it, but I wanted to talk through it first. There would also be adaptive management options and flexibility to deviate from the retention levels if justified by the 1,400 acre murrelet experiment. For the intensives, it may be that there's a way to not draw upon the bucket of buffers at all in intensives. And so one idea is, in the intensives, there's a 50-50 rule where 50% of the acreage in the intensives was allocated to reserve, 50% to intensive. In a lot of the subwatershed replicates for intensives, there are areas of forest under 65 or spans of forest under 65 that were allocated to reserve because of that 50-50 rule. They're still under 65. And so it could be possible to basically do a buffer adjacent to intensive within a subwatershed, whether it's at 150 is the proposed approach, and do it at a higher retention, 60 and above for that 150. And then you could pull acres out of a reserve within that same watershed that's under 65 and allocate that to low retention to make up for the lost acreage that the feathered 150 buffer would be creating. And so in that case, you wouldn't need to draw on a bucket. If it's not possible to do that, either because there's just not, you can't find, there's not the acreage within the reserves, it's less than 65 in that subwatershed, or there are other values at risk like aquatics. You could draw upon the buffer. So that's one approach, and that's based on selectively using the consolidated layer and applying the bucket buffer to it. The next one, and then I want to stop and just take feedback or questions or reactions, is using the full consolidated layer. I think the concept here is use the full consolidated layer because it depicts where the suitable habitat is on the forest, and it's going to be used in the take analysis regardless, because it does depict where a suitable habitat is, and if impacts are happening in it, effects would occur and take would be assessed and counted during the HCP implementation. So the thought would be, all right, if that's the case, use it, and that would expand. Right now, we've got potential habitat based on a 2020 model run that was not updated by the LiDAR data, the more recent LiDAR data. This consolidated layer is. And so the concept would be, within the existing occupied habitat, nothing changes. It's, there's the 1,400 acre experiment around extensive research in occupied. Adjacent to it would go down here. The concept would be to in the extensive treatments within the consolidated layer outside of that occupied habitat, there'd be a portion that would be subject to extensive treatments and kind of designed in a way that keeps the extensive approach to the research design viable, while also having a portion of the consolidated layer available for allocations in ways that's similar to the kind of previous example or the previous approach I discussed. It could be applied in ways where you would do the stitching, use higher retention 60 and above in areas of the consolidated layer where we would connect occupied stands that provide the greatest or with extensive habitat at a higher 60 and above retention range to provide the highest value to protecting the interior habitat. So it wouldn't be everywhere. We would come up with the stitching would happen in areas that are within X distance. We come up with a number of other occupied polygons, and not just any occupied polygon, but something of Y acres in size, sizable to make sure that the interior protection exists. If there's I think the key part of this is where and how that happens. It would be at the biennial level, the biennial planning level, and so you could. You would have the OSU would have the full range of extensive retention available to it in the consolidated layer outside of occupieds, but through the biennial process with the board and the service, there would be a definition of where the extensive treatments would happen, and ideally, locating them in areas that are outside of occupied. But knowing there'd be some take that happens, and then coming up with what the retention levels would be within the extensive treatment stands to do something like these 3 bullets at the end, come up with your locations and your retention levels based on assessing factors or criteria like the relative value of the stand to research versus conservation values, the ability to protect the interior habitats, really focusing the higher retention within the existing and extensive range within areas that are most likely to protect interior habitat, not doing it everywhere, but limited. And then if there are hard edges already, argues for lower retention. So I wanted to take feedback on this before jumping into the financial approaches, and if it helps to depict anything, I think we can do it. We're definitely going to move into maps in the next financial harvest add back segment, but I would say on the last part of this, the bucketed buffer approach, as creative as it was to come up with it in the retreat to try to get the conversation moving forward, it is hard to translate in a quantitative way to something that Fish and Wildlife Service can understand and evaluate in the HCP. And so we're in this space where we're trying to retain flexibility according to biennial planning and this bucket approach, because the flexibility may preserve options around, we may be able to arrange stands when treatment time comes in ways that protect interior habitat adequately without buffers. But for the services, this is a hard one to quantify. Having some kind of an upper level or quantified upper limit on harvest within the extensives outside of the occupied is easier for them to quantify. So I think keep that in mind, I guess, as you're thinking about your feedback. And I think also please keep in mind that on the financials, like all these approaches have impacts. They attempt to address the fact that some felt, that we have unbuffered trimas right now. That wasn't where some believed things were landing based on what they had heard throughout this process. I think including the services. So it's we're trying to address that, but knowing that there will be impacts from any of these options on the financials. That's why we're also having a conversation about the financials and kind of gaining acreage in other areas of the forest. And there's an impact on the research design. And I think front and center on the impacts of the research design is the notion of if the full consolidated layer is going to be used, does that mean anything for the surveying condition that's in the current HCP and has been in the HCP for a while, condition 7? Does it mean anything for the amount of extensives that's allowed? I mean, is it always just going to be the 1,400 acre cap, even with the full consolidated layer brought into potential habitat, if that's the way you go? So I'll leave it to,
Let's take
I don't know who-
Bob and then Paul. Bob, are you on mute?
Yeah, no, I'm not on mute. I'm just trying to figure out how to get my points across in the cleanest, clearest way, because I think this is tough to track. But I guess I would begin with what we had, what we agreed to on Merlettes and where I see us now, because they are radically different. What we had was that trimas were going to be known occupied habitat was going to be protected and buffered. Potential habitat was going to be mapped and surveyed, and if it was found to be occupied, protected. And there was also going to be this 500 to 1,400 acre experiment in occupied habitat where 80% retention would occur. That was a pretty protective standard for Merlettes. Now what we have under this, and mix and match them, is trimas are protected, but they may or may not have buffers. Occupied habitat may or may not have buffers. Potential occupied habitat is no longer going to be surveyed, and it's going to be harvested at upwards of 60% retention. The entire occupied layer or potential occupied layer now has become an experiment along the lines of the 500 to 1,400 acres that was so controversial, arguably the most controversial piece of this puzzle for the conservation community. It's now effectively being expanded out over the entire potentially occupied layer. We would have never agreed to that. That is a mammoth potential impact on Merlettes. That turns all of the discussions about this being, really protective and improving Merlettes to something that's as, if not more aggressive than what we were seeing under the former management regime. So it's a huge problem to me. And so I'll just finish here. What I'm looking for is I think first of all, it should be a no-brainer that the entire consolidated layer, that the maps are going to be updated in order to make them accurate so that we know where all the occupied and potential occupied habitat is. That just has to be part of the puzzle. The next question is, what do you do with it? And I think from my perspective, OSU still needs to meet that I think the bucket strategy can get us close enough to the buffers that will be okay if we also incorporate in some extensive. But I think on that potential occupied layer, it is still critical that OSU surveys and protects where they find merlets. Not that we just allow, 60 to 80% retention across the entire potential layer. It's just a completely different scenario than what we've anticipated for the last 3 years. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bob. Maybe let me see. I think Melissa, you came up. I think maybe to respond to something that Bob said, and then I'll go to Paul and then Colin.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, Bob, I hear what you're saying, and I just want to reorient folks briefly with the commitments that are in the HCP so that we don't get too far off the mark. The HCP, as far as I understand it, would still maintain the commitment to retain and enhance 18,000 acres of occupied habitat and 14,000 acres of modeled potential. So to your point, Bob, there still is the commitment in there to protect that modeled potential habitat. And the discussion isn't around pulling that out, but around how to meet some of these other pieces. So I just wanted to remind folks that that does stand currently in the HCP.
Thanks, Melissa. Paul?
There was an awful lot there, Brett, and I just wrote down some quick notes, and it'll be a shotgun, but just to the potential habitat, every single acre on the Elliott is potential habitat. Every single acre will someday or could someday be habitat. So I never agreed to taking out every single acre of potential habitat. So that's an issue. The adaptive remark that I thought I heard was we would work with Fish and Wildlife as we go down the road. Anything we can do to avoid working with Fish and Wildlife down the road to change what it is we've decided will save us a whole heck of a lot of headaches down the road. I think kicking the can down the road. We need a decision out of them now, not renegotiate what we're doing every 2 years or every year. I think
Paul, on that one, can I think the thought is, yes, there would be a decision now on the HCP and it would be permitted and issued with take. This is not a no-take HCP, there would be take. But down the road, I think that's part of the tension here around the bucket and the biennial planning approach that came forward with the feedback from the retreat is preserving flexibility to plan at the biennial level. And that's where a lot of these decisions around exactly where the harvest would occur and where retention levels would be pegged would occur. And that's where I was indicating that, so long as we're kicking it down the road to the biennial planning process, there's probably still a nexus point with, some engagement with US Fish around what's moving forward, given that take framework.
Anyway, it's a concern. My experience with if we have a bucket of on one to put in reserve and a bucket in the other to mitigate, what that does is plan on the bigger bucket for both, because it's been my experience that there's always desire for more and more to be put in reserves and not managed. The impact is more than the financial when you put it, when you take the extensive and use it for buffers. It changes what you're allowed to do in the extensive. So it isn't just the finances that we're talking about. It changes the flexibility to do research in those areas. It predetermines what you're allowed to do. So if we're not going to be allowed the flexibility to experiment in those areas, then we need to have full watersheds that we are allowed the flexibility to do those experiments. And those are kind of my initial thoughts on what you covered, Brett. I'm sorry, it's a little scattered, but there was a lot there.
Yeah, no, thanks, Paul. It helps. And I know it's hard to find the silver bullet given all of the interests that we're trying to balance. And I know that was a big narrative monologue trying to translate what's in the document that I sent.
And the finances are important. We're at a point now where I just don't think they're not there. When you start adding in everything that we have to do, there's just not much left for the monitoring, for the HCP and the research. It's just not there.
Thanks, Paul. Colin?
I just wanted to share how unbalanced and unhealthy I think this singular focus on marbled murrelets is. We're trying to manage a whole ecosystem, not just one bird. The idea that we're going to survey all potential habitat and protect murrelets wherever they're found is not something that I think we agreed to. It's not something that I agreed to. Doing that would be a take avoidance approach. That's not what we agreed to. We agreed to pursue an HCP, an incidental take permit, which means that there will be negative effects to murrelets. And I've said very clearly that the approach of trying to mitigate away all negative effects to murrelets, even if they're localized and transient, through the use of buffers around occupied habitat is a complete deal breaker for me. And that hasn't changed. It's still a deal breaker. This is a disturbance dominated ecosystem. There's always been disturbance on the Elliott. The disturbances that create these edges that can have short-term negative effects for single birds. Also, those disturbances and those edges also create the habitat that these birds depend on. So the idea of using these buffers to try to mitigate away all negative impacts to murrelets is just simply a deal breaker for me, period.
I think it would be good. I mean, Bob, I think it would be good to hear your response on this, but
I guess my response would be that these deals have been forged over the last 4 years, and we need to look at them and, see if we can make them work. But, respectfully, Colin, you weren't at the table for most of that time. Your predecessor was, and he was there for these discussions. So the idea also that we have a net loss of murrelet habitat over time on a forest that the public paid $221 million for is also not acceptable. There was an expectation this was going to improve things for imperiled species, not undermine them. And so I think we still have that obligation. And I think it is important to talk about the fact that the public did spend $225 million, or $221 million on this, not to see imperiled species further harmed.
Teresa and then Tom, and then we're gonna try to transition. This is kind of helpful pause, and then we're gonna get the financial stuff and then look at the composite together. So go ahead, Teresa.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to a couple of things Colin said, and then just give a little of my own feedback. Is the way I understand it, that not all potential habitat is required to necessarily be surveyed. There's just a small, I think it's like 3,000 some acres that have been mapped within extensive treatments. And that was what OSU wanted to do their research plan on murrelets or their research program on murrelet habitat in. And so the way that was agreed upon was that they would be surveying it in order to actually have good research results. They would know where the nests are and they could test if the nests were occupied or not. So that whole way that was written in the HCP was driven by the research plan around marbled murrelets as well. So just to kind of like bring it back to where we started from and why it's that way. And then Brett, I appreciate all the work you've done. I think it is a lot. And it would be nice to, especially on, I think like a couple of those first options, it seems like could be paired together in a way that could potentially work with the adding in some buffers where it makes sense, or using some extensive where it makes sense, not doing that everywhere, and then having a bucket we can draw from to look at lost volume. I think that would be helpful to potentially get some more detail out. And on that, I think with some of Paul and Colin's points, I think it's important to recognize that no one here is actually saying we are going to be buffering all of the murrelet habitat. We're trying to compromise. That's something that we thought was there. And I've been working a lot with people from OSU to try to look at maps and say, where can we figure out if there are spots where it matters, spots where it doesn't matter? Let's look at interior habitat as the most important thing. So just so you guys also know, I think we're not talking about all of it, and that consolidated layer that OSU put together does exclude some areas of previously mapped trimas that they decided weren't necessarily as valuable because they're really isolated. So we're trying to look at it biologically as well, and now that we've got some updated information. So just wanted to clarify that.
Thanks, Teresa. Tom?
Yeah, thanks, Teresa. That's helpful. I just curious, Bob, going back to your comments, when was there a discussion or commitment that all trimas were going to be buffered? I don't, maybe that was before I arrived in summer of 2020. Could you elaborate on that, please? And because we have, we literally have emails to the contrary, so that came from ICF. So
we asked repeatedly, Tom, whether the data was accurate. You can recall a lot of those conversations where we said, is all of Kim's data in? Are all the trimas in? Are they meeting the Pacific Seabird Protocol? Did they come in intact? Because we were concerned, in fact, that because ODF was updating their stuff to be consistent with the litigation and the settlement, that those wouldn't be on there. So we asked it over and over again. Are the buffers there? Yeah, they're there. It's the full deal.
So
and then they got taken off by ICF, as I understand it from the last meeting. I don't know when that decision was made, but when I heard in the last meeting the question was, could you get an HCP? That wasn't the question we were asking in the room. The question was, are we going to really protect marble murrelets adequately on this forest? You might be able to get an HCP, but it's a different question.
So I'm curious what, I don't know. I've been working with Melissa at ICF and Shannon and Jen and the OSU team on this, and I don't know if any of you have any color to add to this before we keep going and move on. I think the things that are going through my mind are the consolidated layer is something that is being used in the take assessment, the take evaluation framework. We're still wrestling with how do we use it in the actual proposal. I think Bob heard clearly from you, like it depicts the actual suitable habitat in the forest, so use it as potential. There are some portions of it that have been, pulled out, the stringers, narrow portions of over 65 forest. So there would be assessed based on those aren't in the consolidated layer. I think this approach of using the consolidated layer, even if the whole thing is used, still involves take. But the challenge is, I guess as I see it, The way the HCP is written with the condition 7 surveys and the cap on the the extensive harvest experiment, the use of the full consolidated layer would, I think, eat up a lot of the extensive acreage and kind of puts pressure both on the research experiment and on the financials. And we're having a conversation about, you know, how to offset that potentially with other parts of the forest, but it is a little more challenging to think about. You know, potentially there's surveys done and they're expensive. They're really expensive. It drives up HCP compliance costs, and potentially there are areas where murrelets aren't found and in the consolidated layer, and, you know, go forward with extensive work. But there's also the concern over false negatives and how much the surveys really tell you. So yeah, I'd like to draw in some others before we move on, Peter, from OSU and ICF.
Yeah, Tom and Shannon, I think are on ready. Go ahead, Tom, and then Shannon.
Well, why don't I let Shannon go ahead, and depending on what she says, I'll jump back in.
Okay.
So just, I guess, providing a little bit more background from what we're seeing with some of these analyses, you know, I think that, well, understand very clearly from Bob and Teresa and others that there was that there was an understanding from them that there were buffers included. That was not part of any of the documentation that OSU put out, and we were told back in August 2019 with the analyses that were being done, not to include buffers, to just include the trimas and not the buffers that ODF would put on as part of their tape avoidance strategy. So I think that's where the misunderstanding goes back to. And it's helpful to hear the full range of perspectives from the board about, you know, the values around extensive and the values around conserving murrelet habitat, which is something that that full range is what we're also really interested in, conserving on the Elliott and having that conservation happen in a research context so that we can understand the disturbance history, management, and conservation tactics that are really needed to help support biodiversity and imperiled species. You know, as we're talking about, there were a lot of options that Brett described that's in the current change framework draft. If we're sort of on one end thinking about the buffer approach, and we've had some conversations with Teresa, and she's identified some potential options that she sees, as well as Bob and others. A couple of things that we're continuing to try to look at are, what are the impacts on the financials? What are the areas where protections would have the most benefit based on the science that we have now for murrelets? And what are the impacts on the triad research design? And so with having a buffer approach in the trimas, in those two bands in the MRW, and then looking for acres elsewhere in the forest to offset that, we may be able to balance the financials that way, but that still has an impact on the research design within any given subwatershed. And there are some ideas about how do we mitigate for that. Maybe we try to make some adjustments. We were having a conversation with Teresa about that last week, just looking at an example, and I think there are some better examples that we could look at too together. But there are also all of these other considerations that Brett was mentioning around, okay, maybe there are some areas with younger reserves and we could make some adjustments there, but in a lot of cases, those areas were put into reserve because of considerations for aquatic species in the HCP or steep slopes. So all of these things would need to be balanced. And from an experimental perspective, it's difficult if those decisions are happening at the biennial operations planning process. Although on the flip side, we would have more detailed information then as we're in that planning phase, the operational planning phase. And then the other thing that we've been talking about is this use of the consolidated layer, which is based on the updated LiDAR layer that we have identifying potential murrelet habitat. A couple of things that we're seeing with that is the survey requirements that we have in the HCP, and they relate to the conversations that are happening today. Just a back of the envelope calculation, if we were to contract for those, it would be about $20,000 a stand with the new PSG protocols. And there might be some ways to make some adjustments to build some in-house capacity, but that's one of the things that we're trying to balance as we think about steps forward here, and then also the financials and budgeting. And then the other piece is the impact on the research design. And in particular, if we're looking at what the consolidated layer identifies, which is broader areas of older forests, the part of the research design that most significantly impacts is the triad E. So I just wanted to, I guess, share that information with the board as you're having these conversations so that you have all of those pieces in the back of your minds as well. And Tom, I didn't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add to that.
I think you captured it. I think it's important to look back at all the documentation which is extensive, going back to 2019, and there is no additional mention of buffering on primas, or mention of buffering on primas in any of the documentation that we have access to, except that the ICF specifically telling us in 2019, August 2019, so roughly a year before I was even here, that buffers were to be left off. So I just, I think that this is all based on total mitigation, giving mitigation credit for the extensive areas being put into reserve, both the large block reserve and the distributed reserves in the MRW, and with the intent of ultimately being issued an incidental take permit. And with also the fact that all of the treatments, with a modest exception of 500 to 1,400 acres of being in existing plantations. And of course, then the question that we've sort of gone back and forth on around buffering on those.
You just put yourself on mute, Tom.
Oops, I accidentally hit the space bar while talking. Anyhow, I think that was probably a good sign that it was time to stop talking. But anyhow, point being that there.
So yeah, let's, Keith, I think I want to get you in, and then we'll take Keith, and then I'll ask my question.
Okay, thank you. I try to remind I joke with my daughters all the time that I'm a simple guy, and they always change that and say, "No, Dad, you're a simpleton." I'm not sure I like that, but they have a good sense of humor. So I want to come back to this, and and just something simple. This has come up a couple of times, 2 or 3 times. It's been mentioned with the $220 million and what that bought for the people of the state of Oregon. The intent with that $220 million was to fund a world-class research forest. And that is the heart and soul of what we've been trying to do here since for 4 and some years. And I know that's a simple statement, but and with that, then there are all kinds of things we have to balance. Habitat and aquatics and harvest to pay for revenue, or to create revenue to pay for the research, and we've got to maintain roads, and we've set aside 40% of the forest right off the top. And so that was the one thing I'm listened eagerly to all points, but the one thing I wanted to come back to, and you guys all know that I'm not very reluctant to jump in, but the one thing here I wanted to say was the $220 million the state put in, I thought Vicky would jump in here too, was to, it was at least in my mind and from the beginning was to fund a world-class research forest. Now, there are things that come with that, but that was the primary goal of the state of Oregon here. Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. All right. If it's okay, we'll transition to the second topic, trying to preserve enough time for some conversation afterwards, and then time for public comment. And Francis, I have you on that list.
Okay, yeah. On how to land potential feedback, or where the feedback lands on this, and how to land something that's potentially like where you can all meet. I don't know that it's helpful, I guess, to keep coming back to this. Should buffers have been there? Should they not have been there? I think the reality is we're here. There's a concern about interior habitat protection that's come up in the context of the HCP, but also from prospective board members that have been part of the negotiations and will be part of the authority moving forward. And so it's like, what are we going to do about where we are? And there's this tension between where things land on conservation and where things are going on the financials. And then the research design is, I feel like, being battered in the middle of it around the extensives. And so we've got some stuff to come back to, but we'll just dive into the other part, the financials.
The only other question that I have was for the OSU team on this. Do you, there's a lot to digest in the options or the tiers that were put forward. Does the OSU team have a preference given impacts to, or potential impacts to the research design? Is there something that's more appealing or not within this that you would want the board to be aware of?
I think all of these options have an impact on the research design and the financials. And they're all connected to the other pieces of what we're talking about here today too, with the financials and looking for acres to balance. So, the other piece that we're working on really closely with Fish and Wildlife and DSL is the take analysis to sort of inform where we are as we work towards solutions. So at this stage, we're really interested in hearing what the prospective board sees as sort of the range of what you expect, and also based on the HCP and the research proposal and the solution space that we're trying to find. But really, we're looking for the take analysis and to also help inform these conversations.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay, briefly, Bob, and then Paul, and then we'll transition to financials. Sorry, I reopened this, but that's okay. All right.
I actually agree with Keith that part of it was a world-class forest, but I don't think we would have a world-class forest if it becomes a place that significantly degrades marble murrelet habitat a year after they were uplisted from threatened to endangered under the Endangered Species Act in the best marble murrelet habitat in the Pacific Northwest. I mean, this is ground zero for murrelets. So it's really hard to get my head around the idea that this would be a world-class research forest if it is predicated on significant degradation of marble murrelet habitat. We're getting high centered on the buffers. I think those are really important, but actually what's more important to me here is the potential habitat, because that is a massive shift too. If we're talking about just getting rid of those surveys, and those are in there, they're in the HCP, we're talking about a much, much higher level of take than we've ever discussed before. And it shifts the entire analysis. And we did go out and tell the public that we were going to protect the vast majority of marble murrelet habitat, that we were going to add more over time. And we're stepping significantly away from that. You know, Paul said at the beginning of this, if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work. And I think if we're talking about this scale of shift on the marble murrelet, literally 4 years into the process, then I think it doesn't work.
Thanks, Bob. Okay, you're drawing them into the conversation. Go ahead, Paul.
Now I forgot what I was going to say. I don't have a problem with buffering this or buffering that, but there has to be give and take. If you take an acre here, you got to put an acre back. It's just that simple, and I've said it 2 or 3 times now. You're not negotiating with me. You're negotiating on whether this will be a success or not. And if you take out more acreage, you're killing the project. You're literally killing the project, and I don't want to see that happen. And I think we need to keep in mind that take isn't necessarily degrading anything. You can drive by a murrelet nest on your bicycle and it flies away, and that's a take. Anything that disturbs, harasses, is a take.
So I'm gonna.
What's
Thanks,
that?
Paul. No, I didn't mean to cut you off. I was thinking that I wanted to emphasize the piece that you were saying about the financial components, knowing that we've got about an hour, and I want to make sure we get to that.
Okay, I'm done ranting.
All right, briefly, Melissa, and then Tom, and then we're going to transition.
Thanks. Yeah, and I just wanted to follow up, Bob, on the piece you mentioned about rolling back the protections that were in the HCP. And I know I brought this up earlier, but I just want to revisit it again one more time. And, you know, maybe this is something that DSL we can talk about later too and weigh in on, so we're doing a better job of presenting this. But I don't think that the intention is to turn away from the commitments of protecting the occupied and potential modeled habitat that is in there, nor is there an intent to change on the increase in suitable habitat that is proposed to be protected over the course of the permit term, which, you know, as a reminder, I think is around 21,000 acres of habitat that fall in the CRW, the MRW reserves, and the RCAs. So those aren't going to be harvested as a function of how the research design is set up and, you know, allowed to grow up and provide habitat. So that's an additive benefit over the course of the permit term. As far as the survey commitments go, I also don't think the intent is to roll back from the surveys that are currently committed to in the HCP. It's that it's additive surveys based on some of the buffering would be where there's additional costs that wasn't accounted for. And, you know, Brett, correct me if I'm wrong in that, but that is my understanding. So it's not changing what was, but talking about the implications of implementing, you know, what is needed to move forward. And, you know, to Paul's point, you know, the conversation around shifting things around to meet the financial piece is to ensure it's not, again, to roll back the murrelet protections, but to ensure that, you know, if there are changes that need to be made to provide those protections, that the financials can still be met. And how can we do that in a way that's going to sort of meet all of the variables on the forest?
Yeah, I'm going to jump in with a question without my hand raised. For the guy who's run around up there for the last 40 some years, but not looking at it from a potential habitat point of view, just what becomes potential murrelet habitat? Bob has or Paul, excuse me, has said that theoretically almost the entire forest is potential habitat. And I'm not agreeing or disputing that. I don't know. So for the folks who know, and we can all, and so at least I can be speaking on the same, and with the same level of understanding as everybody else. What in the heck determines what is or will be defined as potential habitat? And then
I think Keith, I think Brett's got a 3-word answer, and then we're going to transition. Tom, you're okay? It looked like your hand went down.
I think Melissa mostly covered. I was going to clarify a couple things, but I can sit on it for now.
Well, and I think some of this, this is relevant to where things go, but it's hard to figure out where things go without having the other part of the conversation around the financials. So, but Keith, I think the short answer is, for purposes of the HCP, I mean, the idea, the consolidated layer depicts the areas of suitable habitat that exist on the forest based on the most recent LiDAR run. And that would be what, would be considered the potential habitat. I mean, I think what Paul's getting at is anything, if you let it grow out there, you grow into suitable habitat. But that's part of the point of the HCP, is to take advantage of the no surprises policy. So where you have areas that are not in the consolidated layer and younger forests, as they grow forward, they wouldn't be in the future considered, part of the potential habitat layer. I mean, they would in the CRW reserves where you have thinning, restoration thinning, and that intention, but in the intensives, in the extensives less than 65, you would. I think Paul was getting at the potential is out there though for on this kind of a forest for that to happen.
All right.
So, okay. I want to try to run. So the other side of this conversation is whether it's to offset anything, any moving forward direction around the MRW conservation from murrelets, or whether it's to address the broader financial concerns. The board retreat asked for some specific, let me pull up where we are, some specific direction around, or specific analysis rather, around, and then options around areas to go in the forest for potential, let me share my screen, potential financial viability harvest add backs. And all right, here we go. So the ask was for analysis. I'm going to just cover it really quick. And then ask a few folks to kind of put some maps up that I think will help the discussion. So this is the tier 3 conversation around the interest is in not doing more intensives everywhere on the forest or in the CRW or in the MRW, but where could you find some areas that could be dedicated to long rotation or extensive forestry? And that's one thing we need to hear back from you all is what kind of forestry do you want? I mean, if there is feedback on future direction, is it long rotation or is it extensive? They're different. And so please keep that in mind as you give feedback on this. So the first area that we looked at based on the ask for feedback from the retreat is in the CRW. And so there were 2 areas that jumped out. I think I have them listed in order of what seems potentially pretty viable. There's the central eastern edge of the forest and then the northwest corner of the forest. And I'm going to put a couple maps up and then ask folks to speak to these. There are some candidates of areas of the CRW that are less than 65. And so the assumption is if we move forward with changes to the research or the landscape design that bring these portions of the forest into either a long rotation or extensive allocation or approach, there would still be the aquatic conservation protections applied. There would still be protections applied for the older forest. Basically ensure HCP viability. And I think one of the caveats with all of these is whatever feedback we get today, we need to take it back into the HCP conversation and make sure we're still going to come out of it with take permit and that we haven't done something unwittingly to compromise either the aquatics or other values on the forest related to different species. So central eastern edge, I'm going to ask Deanne or somebody from OSU. I don't think we have time or need to go through the detail here. I think the two areas that we've looked at with further analysis are these two. This upper Big Creek area just southeast of the bullseye, and then the Alder Creek area up in the northwest portion of the CRW. There are numbers in the materials that went out around the amount of acreage that's less than 65. And so we did the analysis assuming that's what we're talking about when talking about converting any acres to extensive or longer rotation. And there are depictions of those areas here where you've got within the Alder Creek area. It's a little more complicated. What this layer doesn't depict is the consolidated layer, but it does depict the occupied murrelet habitat plus the what's currently proposed for restoration thinnings and what is allocated to CRW older forest. And so the kind of lighter, I don't know, skin, whatever, pale, what do you call that?
Mauve.
Yeah, I don't know, Caladril lotion color. That's kind of the acreage that we'd be talking about. The upper Big Creek area seems to have some viability with maybe less complications in certain areas of the northwest portion. But can I get, I don't know if we need to or want to dive in any deeper on this with Shannon, is there anything that the OSU team wants to really highlight here? And then I'd go to Ryan and Melissa too for your view on these areas. And then what's in here at the bottom, let me just touch on this, is OSU worked up some of the estimates in these tables related to long rotation forestry and what that could mean. So I think high level takeaways is what we want here, not deep dive on like all the details, but we're looking at giving the board some feedback on, based on the analysis we did, starting with these CRW areas, and we've got others to work through. What are the takeaways for us on what we're seeing? So Deanne or Shannon, you want to jump in at all, or anyone from the OSU team, Katie or Ryan or Melissa?
Yeah, I think, Deanne, if you wouldn't mind just giving a brief overview of, based on the direction we got at the board retreat, how these two areas were identified, and then just the high level of what those calculations are.
Sure. Brett, could you move back to the first slide? Good. Can you get to the? Can you show the first
He's
one?
working on it.
Just one sec here, bear with me. The heck? Sorry, I'm having computer problems. There we go.
That's okay. Don't worry about it. Oh, okay, there we go. All right, so these were two areas that were identified as potential areas with stands that could be put into some harvest category. The area in the northwest there is that Alder Creek. I called it Alder Creek because there's a creek in there called Alder Creek. There were a lot of creeks, but Alder Creek was the shortest, easiest name to remember. Same thing with Big Creek.
Big Creek is adjacent to the CRW. As you can see, the Alder Creek is intermingled with private industrial lands to the northwest. So yeah, if you could scroll down to the bottom to the lower one. Oh wait, stop right there. We'll just look at the acres. So I broke this into stands greater than 65 and stands less than 65. That's just kind of been our convention. There is some discussion of using an 80-year age class. 65 really has the same effect because there's very few stands between the ages of 65 and 100 on the Elliott. So we use 65 because that signifies when plantation management began roughly in 1955. So anyway, this shows the areas less than 65, and there are some areas greater than 65 for purposes of looking at total number of acres, the net harvest base there, net of a 200-foot RCA, which was the conventional RCA that we applied within the CRW. This is net of the 200-foot RCA, and this is assuming a 10% retention. This was something Colin had mentioned in discussing of how we might look at these lands as potential long rotation forestry. So in the bottom part of that table, those values, those acres are net of the RCA, net of a 10% retention. Okay, if you could go down to the lower one.
Can you say that one more time, Dan?
Yeah, if you can go to the lower slide.
Yeah.
There we go. Thank you. So this shows those with a couple of the resource values associated in the associated area. The crosshatched black are trimas, the ODF trimas. The kind of the red color, if you want to make a distinction of where the consolidated layer is, those are the stands over 65. That's also what would be in what we've been calling the consolidated layer. So the consolidated layer is more or less represented here. All you have to do is look for stands that are over 65. Also, you can see where the RCAs are. There's northern spotted owl circle. What's shown in green is the core habitat, which is a half-mile circle around the activity center. By and large, in doing analyses in these areas, I don't view NSO as being a constraint on management in this area, because the requirement in the core area to keep 50% nesting, roosting, and forage is largely met by reserves, and it's going to be met, especially in long rotation forestry, by the older stands that are in that harvest regime. And if you can scroll down just a wee bit more to that table, I'll try to explain the table just very briefly. We looked at what would be a long rotation mean annual increment. That's what the MAI stands for there, the mean annual increment, how much is going to grow every year on an acre of forest land. And I'm able to get a pretty good estimate of the site based given the tree heights and the ODF stand ages. And I estimate that it's about a site 2 or king site 120. That's a pretty good stand, pretty good site. And that would have a mean annual increment of 865. Recall that in some of our other discussions, we've talked about mean annual increments in the area of 500 to 600 board feet. This is roughly a culmination of mean annual increment. This would be the rotation age that provides the optimal timber volume. And if in looking at how we might harvest this, I calculated acres based on that net acreage there. Based on 120-year rotation, how much would you harvest every year? So we might harvest in the Alder Creek area, 12.4 acres per year, and Upper Big Creek, 4.6 acres per year. 1/120th of the net acres available for harvest. Obviously, you wouldn't do that harvest in just 1 year. You'd maybe do it decadally or in some other time scale, and probably a larger harvest units. But that's just for comparison. And for comparison, for estimating the volume that would come off of the forest, estimating if we were to start right now harvesting in that area, there are some stands that are age 65. They're not very well stocked. I estimate that there's about 27,000 board feet to the acre in those stands currently, or in 2024, when we might anticipate the beginning of the HCP period. The volumes there that would come between both of them, roughly 460,000 board feet. That would be in terms of what we might expect on an annual harvest, or in other terms, what it might contribute to an annual sustained yield from the forest.
And yeah, and Deanna, I think watching the clock. So the takeaway on this for you is there's some opportunity here. Is that right?
Okay, sorry. And then at the long rotation age, because it's a culmination of mean annual increment, the harvest would eventually reach 1.4 million board feet per year from these combined from these lands.
Yeah. Yeah, and then Melissa and Ryan, any feedback from you on these areas? I want to, before I move on to East Hackey and the NSO 46 site.
No,
Anything
nothing
that you
from
wanna
me,
add?
Brett. I'd say just move on.
Okay, Melissa?
Yeah, I guess the only question I have, Deanne, is when looking at the owl circles, the, core habitat is a 50% retention of high quality, and then the home range is the 40% retention of NERF. And so I heard you mention the core habitat piece, but do you have the NERF part calculated in with the numbers that you just presented?
No.
Can you email that question to her? Just, I'm cognizant of the altitude of our conversation here, and it may be too far down for most of what we need today.
Yeah, we can calculate that.
Thank you.
Okay. So we can come back to any one of these. I just want to be sure we get up there in terms of the feedback here. And I'm going to go to the next one, which is where'd it go? East Hackey. Okay, let me get there. Sorry. Where the heck is East Hackey? East Hackey Ridge, where are you?
From your email,
Yeah.
that document. 2:27 a.m.
Yeah, no, I've got it open. It's just okay. Let me just I'll speak to it while I'm finding it amidst the other documents open here. So the proposal for East Hackey would basically be similar in the sense that there is about the big chunk of reserve in the middle of East Hackey, and about 300. The proposed approach would be to add from the current intensive planned acres in East Hackey about 310 acres. If somebody can pull up East Hackey doc, I don't know, Peter, if you have the East Hackey document from last night. For some reason, it's not showing up in my. All right, there we go. Thank you, whoever just did that. So if you look at the map here, just to talk through it really quick, then we'll keep moving on. The East Hackey Ridge parcel has not, it's an MRW parcel right now. It's obviously got a deep and rich history around it. And the way it's parked in the current HCP is the board would need to decide at some point how exactly it would come into management within. It's been incorporated into the permit boundary, but how exactly it would be managed. We've done an HCP approach for analysis purposes. This would deepen it and basically say, to bring it in, this is how it could go. And the area in green would be brought in as reserve, subject to reserve management, including restoration thinnings. The area in yellow would be brought in either as long rotation or extensive. And I think the net acreage, if we can go down to the table at the bottom, is around 310 acres. And you can see the differences between the analysis approach, which is in the previous column in the middle of table 1. That's how it was analyzed, or is being analyzed under the current HCP. If we do a revision under a proposed, this is how it would be analyzed. There are some areas, I think the increase in the reserves relative to the analysis, the current analysis approach, is related to a pocket of intensive that's right in the middle of the current reserve acreage. And then a pocket to the south. If you scroll back up real quick, thanks, Dan. A pocket to the south of the central reserve area, but kind of also overlapping with the spotted owl circle and extending into that blue RCA and north. That portion, as well as the kind of little circle peninsula that dips into the spotted owl, the murrelet habitat in the middle, those portions were allocated to reserve for purposes of thinking through how continuity could exist with, over time, the board forestry lands to the south, and potential practical implications of getting in there, given the spotted owl, RCA, and murrelet issues. There could be ways to talk about it slightly differently, but for purposes of just putting something forward, this is what we looked at. And so it would be, around 310 acres that could come into the long rotation or extensive financial viability part of this. So the other part, I wanted to roll through these and then get more feedback on this next one. We looked at the spotted owl circle. If we could, I can share my screen on this one. Is that you, Deanne, who's sharing?
Jenna.
Or Jenna? Thank you, Jenna. So the spotted owl circle 46 is the next piece of this. And I'm going to go to it right here. This is in the south western portion of the forest. I've skipped a slide just to kind of cut to the chase on time. So this is in the southwestern portion of the MRW. So it's outside the CRW. There's a spotted owl circle that appears to meet, and there are details in the documents that were sent out, but it appears to meet abandonment requirements. There hasn't been spotted owl activity here in this circle for quite some time, and there's barred owl activity and detection since then. I think the conversation point here is around assuming those abandonment standards are met and this circle goes away, are there portions of this area, this MRW area, partial, that could be brought into some kind of management, either as long rotation or extensive? And I want to draw kind of feedback in from others, but I think from my takeaway, we looked into this and it wasn't appearing as a very viable place to go for a variety of reasons, and some of which relate to the existing aquatic values there. There are, you can see on here, are high intrinsic stream potential for coho areas within this spotted owl circle that are pretty significant. This overall area is within the Coos independent population, which is one of the areas where there would be already the highest impacts from the research design. And so we may be getting into some trickier conversations with on the aquatic side if we go into this area, or depending on how any proposal would look. The murrelet overlay is another one that, aside from the spotted owl issue, there's a good amount of murrelet habitat in here. There are already some areas of, and I think Deanne looked at this pretty closely with LiDAR. There's a big swath in here that is already looking, I mean, it's heterogeneous, multi-layered forest that is aging forward, kind of based on what OSU's proposed things would want, what you want to see with extensive development. And that, I mean, the conditions are developing nicely on their own, and given the complexity and the overlays, it was kind of a question of, well, what would we really gain by doing something like extensive or long rotation if it's already moving along pretty well? There are some areas in here of intensive allocations that you might be able to convert, but we're talking steep slopes. So this one didn't have a ton of potential, but we didn't give up on it. And I wanted to see if Ryan, Melissa, or Deanne had any color to add on this.
No, Brett, this is Ryan. Yeah, I think as we looked at this more and more, we thought there would be some potential here, but yeah, the more you unpack it, it doesn't look very viable for a number of reasons that you stated. So I think it's probably an area to stay away from.
Yeah, same, nothing more to add from me. It was, layering the other species encumbrances on there to see how viable this was and realizing that it does provide important protections to other species that are covered under this HCP.
Yes.
Plus, it's so chopped up that the accessibility, the operability of it just probably just isn't there.
Yeah. Okay, and so running through the last bits, and then Peter, I know we need to get into the conversation here. The last bits of what we looked at are, let me go back to the overall framework document. We looked at long rotation forestry and intensives. And so this is something to, sorry, let me go to the partials first. We looked at various options in the MRW partial watersheds, and we could put a map up, but let me just try to verbalize where I think we are on this. There are a variety of partials on the exterior of the MRW. Most of the less than 65 stands in those MRW partials have already been allocated to the harvest base. So if we were to do something in there to try to improve financial viability, it probably involves, I think when we looked at it, converting either what's in the partials right now as designated extensive or designated as partial reserves into a long rotation or extensive approach. And, if you want to help the financial viability and meet some of the interests that have come forward around long rotation or extensives from either the CT Klutzy or Paul or others, I think, we're putting a variety of options on the table, but in the partials, I think it would involve, one approach could involve taking the MRW partial reserves, keeping some conditions on them related to occupied murrelet and spotted owl core habitat, protecting those, keeping aquatic protections, and having anything that's in the reserves that overlaps the consolidated layer in some, 60 and above retention for extensive, do that as kind of an overlay, but then take the rest of it, what's in the partials that are outside of those areas and manage them free of constraints. And so, you've got roughly 4,600 acres of MRW reserves. And within that, only 196 acres are less than 65. And there are 355 acres within the 65 to 80 year range. And so, we have to look at it a little more carefully because some of the younger stands have been allocated in ways to address steep slopes, but there may be a way to get at long rotation allocations or extensive allocations to the partials in the reserves outside of those kind of that protective condition overlay. And what else to say about the partials? Anybody, Shannon or Ryan or Melissa, anything?
Maybe, and I think you got to this, but looking at some of the partials, particularly in the southeast portion of the forest, where it seems like there might be some ability to do some reallocation without affecting the species. To use Deanne's words, those have already been sort of allocated to the extent that they could. So they're already taking advantage of what can be intensive and extensive. So there's not space there to do any additional changes. If you were to look at that allocation layer, you would see, you know, those kind of pieces that align down there are largely already in intensive allocation if they are less than 65 years, as Brett was saying.
Yes, and currently all the intensive and all the extensive is in less than 65 years in the MRW partials. So that acreage that Brett was talking about, the 4,655 acres approximately of reserve that's in the MRW partials, most of that is greater than 65. There's about 196 acres that's less than 65.
Yeah, and as we looked into it more, just there's a reason that those are in reserves. There's just a lot of resource concerns with those MRW partial reserves. So it's just really tough to find areas to go that aren't going to have adverse impacts. So it's looking pretty tough in those.
Okay, so the last bit to cover, and for the sake of time, we can come back and show maps if it helps anybody, but I think we wanted to be responsive on the concepts first, and then make sure we have time for conversation. And during the conversation, please ask any of us to pull things up. The last bits here are long rotation forestry and extensives. And so Paul had put this on the table at the retreat. And I think there's some conversation that it would be good to have around, you know, what that would mean. And I mean, if anybody from OSU wants to jump into it, I think the idea was, if there is the incentives have not been allocated as long rotation, it's, you know, 60 year, and if there was a shift in that, what are the trade-offs, both on the financials, and then I think the other consideration is becomes harder to differentiate between intensives managed at 100-year rotation and extensive forestry adjacent to it for purposes of detecting impacts on resource values through research. But there's also a way to potentially do this that deals with the wall of wood, balancing near-term financial needs. You know, maybe not everything goes into 100-year rotation at first, but maybe there's a way to still do it to some degree. And I don't know if OSU can put any more color on this one than I have. I think you probably can. So if you could jump in, that'd be great. And then I want to be sure we talk about at least the last one here of a potential replicate change within the MRW. So anything on long rotation from the OSU end?
I guess if nobody else will, I will just very briefly. In shifting to long rotation, of course, what that means, if we go from a 60 to 100-year rotation, a lot of the stands are just now approaching harvest age at 60 years of age and would be scheduled for harvest in the near term and contribute to financial returns. If we move that to a 120-year rotation, it would be 60 years before those same stands would reach the scheduled harvest age, you know, notwithstanding some intermediate treatment like thinning.
And just to be clear, I think Paul and Colin Paul at the retreat talked about a potential ramp up that would try to ameliorate that sort of potential impact.
Yep. Yeah, I'm getting there. It's next on the schedule. So one way to get there with that is to schedule those harvests on on what foresters call would be an area, no, I can't remember what, but an area control harvest schedule or harvest regulation. And so we would, as I just discussed with that area in the Northwest, put that on area control. So you'd harvest, instead of just averaging 1/60th of the area per year, you'd harvest 1/120th of the area per year. The problem with that then is the advantage of that is you get harvest immediately, but you're only harvesting half the acres you would have otherwise. So ramping up to a longer rotation it's hard to, I can't see a way to do it without affecting the cut in the short term. So yeah, I'll be quiet now.
Teresa, do you have a question on that?
I was gonna offer some comments, but if that's not a good time, I can do that later.
No, I think go for it.
Just a couple things on that. I had suggested potentially looking based on what, Paul said, ramping up to it, looking at the early implementation watersheds as continuing with those in a shorter rotation and then doing longer rotations elsewhere for that earlier revenue. And then just another note on the partial watersheds. I also had suggested, kind of also in response to some of the things that the tribes had said, I feel like there's not really a reason to have that necessarily intensive allocation as like, this is the rotation year and this is how much is taken out of it and these percent rotations. Like, I think it's not part of the research design. And so it seems to make sense to me to allow the all those younger stands to be managed basically without any constraints, and that we could decide to, high grade and take as much out as we want in as many, periods of years as we want. That makes sense. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation.
Teresa, you're talking about younger stands that would exist basically outside the consolidated layer and the aquatic protections.
Yeah, exactly. The stuff that's not, that you've mentioned is right now allocated to be intensive stands because they're in partial watersheds and they're under 65.
Yeah, okay. I feel like we're getting into the discussion on the different options here. The one that we haven't covered yet, and I wanted to be sure. I mean, there's another one related to Board of Forestry lands, and I feel like it's potential down the line to increase acreage, but it's not necessarily as close to the windshield of what's possible right now. So let me just say on the last one that I wanted to be sure we cover is the triad design change around. Currently, there are an excess in replicates within the MRW, and I'd like OSU to speak to the extent you can on this. What we looked at was potentially identifying an excess replicate in the MRW and likely in the excess being in the intensive with 50% reserve replicate or allocation, allocating one of those sub watersheds, potentially to long rotation forestry, getting at some of the issues that have been raised around the desire to see that type of forestry, both raised by the tribe as well as others. And if OSU could speak to that, what's possibly potential there and implications on the financials, good, bad, or indifferent.
Yeah, so one of the things that we've been looking into, Brett, is what you have outlined here. So with the MRW assignments, because of the age class distribution and the research design, there are 10 replicates of Triad E and Triad I. There's 9 of extensive, and then 11 of the reserve with intensive, which is 50% reserve and 50% intensive. So if we're looking at adjusting how one of these extra replicates would be treated, I think the question that we have for for the board is what would you want to see done with it? And how does that address some of the things that that CT Klutzy have brought up in the letter from Tribal Council that the board received, as well as financials or other interests. So within, if we're just looking at the reserve with intensive, there are several of those sub-watersheds. There are 4 of them that have been identified for early implementation of the research design. So that means that those would be the watersheds where monitoring more intensively would happen. So you have that period of pretreatment monitoring that we were talking about at the retreat, followed by treatments in the intensive and not in the reserve. And so there's that consideration. There's also just characteristics of the sub-watershed. And then as Deanne was talking about, if the interest is in using one of these watersheds to shift towards long rotation forestry, what are the near-term impacts if we're looking at an area control basis to get there on the overall financial piece? Because I think that was one of the reasons why this was brought up. So alongside those concerns, this involves looking at the areas that are in reserve that are less than 65. That was something I think, Brett, you mentioned in here. Because of the tri-design allocations, 50% of the watershed is in intensive and 50% is in reserve. That does include varying degrees of younger areas in reserve. And some of those were put into reserve for a specific reason, such as protections for headwalls and steep slopes. Other areas might have some more flexibility. So there could be the potential for, if you're moving a watershed in a direction of long rotation forestry, conserving all the reserves over 65 and other areas that have other protection considerations, there could be some additional acres that would be moved into long rotation harvest.
And Shannon, you think there are some candidates, it looks like?
Again, it depends on how we're thinking about long rotation harvest and the impact on the financials, but that's something that we can continue to look at. I think the early implementation watersheds would be really difficult because of how they've been built into the research design so far. There are other watersheds of varying sizes that we could look at as possibilities.
Thanks, Shannon. So anything else sort of for orientation? Otherwise, I'm going to go to Colin and then Teresa. Keith, just so folks are aware, Jennifer had to step away. She's going to be back shortly. And Keith also just chatted that he will be back in a few, but he does have a question in the chat for folks. Colin.
Yeah, point of clarification. I wanted to make it clear that the tribe does not want to see more intensive acres. Even if those intensive acres are long rotation intensive acres, we don't want to see more intensive acres. I think the point made in Tribal Council's letter was that for the intensive acres, those acres should be managed on a longer rotation that maximizes the long-term value rather than maximizing short-term value. So want to be really clear there. We don't want to see more industrial style management. Don't want to see more intensive acres. We do want to see significantly more extensive holistic style management acres.
Thanks for that clarification, Colin. That's really helpful. And again, we're just offering this up as a solution if a solution is needed to a problem that we're dealing with together. But thank you, that's helpful.
Colin, does that feedback fit everything we've talked, whether it's East Hackey or the CRW changes, or these MRW partials, or this kind of excess replicate? Is that the general take, is the tribe would like to see extensive rather than long rotation?
Yeah, that's right.
Thanks, Colin. Teresa? Oh, you're on mute, I think.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I kind of echoing what Colin said. I think if we're looking at taking out a replicate from the research design, for this kind of goes for the partials and East Hackey and other things we've talked about. I'd like to maybe move away from just working within the, like, it's either intensive or extensive only with this retention boundary. You know, I think we're taking it out of the research design. We can manage it basically using what we could call extensive or ecological forestry, but at whatever interval or retention that makes sense for the area. So I just think allowing for some places on the forest with more flexibility like that could be really beneficial, because it doesn't really exist right now within the research design. There's kind of like lots of boundaries on what's happening. So just putting that in. And then I was looking at some areas that I think could have a multiple benefits of what's currently, you know, a watershed that's 50% intensive and 50% reserve. If you took out one or two of those and had either only 10 or 9 replicates of those types of watersheds, it seems like you could, if you kind of put all those intensive stands and reserves that are under 65 in a more flexible, extensive designation, it'd be beneficial for endangered species and probably for revenue, and allow for some different kinds of management on the forest. So that's what I think could make a lot of sense there.
Thanks, Teresa. Others? Comments, questions, reactions? Let's start calling on people.
I mean, of all of the areas / options on the table, where are folks, like, pursue all of them, pursue certain ones of them?
And maybe a related question for the team. So, well, actually, I'll wait. Let's see. Paul, Jack, then Mike.
I'd like to hear Jack jump in and Mike, and then I'll go after them.
Thanks, Paul.
Okay, just to capture a few things, and there's obviously a lot that's been thrown out here, and I think there's a lot of good ideas. I do like you know, these longer rotation concepts, both for you know, intensive and some of these other areas that we've put out on the table. It seems like there's some opportunities there. You know, I do come back to this, you know, in the back of my mind, I'm still thinking that, you know, these forests are dynamic. They're likely to get much more dynamic in the future. So, you know, that idea of experimenting to be able to do some different things is going to be really important to us. So, you know, I like, you know, if we can move away a little bit more from, you know, a triad that has 50% reserve and 50% intensive, you know, that seems like not what we want to focus on. So I like a lot of what the comments are, and you know, it's just, there's a lot there. So
Thanks, Jack. Mike?
I agree with Jack. You said about half of what I was about to say. So very good.
Let's hear it from you too.
So, you know, in all the various options, I would say pursue all of them that make sense. Obviously, that spotted owl one didn't seem to make, circle didn't seem to make much financial sense. Some of the partials, some made sense, some didn't. But I would say pursue as many options as possible. But I would agree, the more flexibility that we can have over time, as far as looking at different potential ways of managing, and not just locked into just one research design, but be flexible enough to change the design or to put different designs in different areas as we move along. I think that would be definitely beneficial. And I agree with with what Colin was saying too about some of the more extensive. We've seen a lot of what industrial forestry can do. We know it can produce revenue, it can produce wood. And we do need some comparison to that in looking at other ways of doing things. But the more options we have for looking at multiple other ways of doing things through the future, I think would be definitely beneficial. But that all being said, we still have to operate within the budget that this will produce. And while we've also been shooting for a world-class research forest, I'm thinking along the lines of cars. It'd be wonderful to have a Cadillac, but if we only have a Chevrolet budget, that's all we can afford. So we have to live within what we can afford.
Thank you, Mike. Paul, and then Keith, you had a question. I'm gonna in the chat and I'll come to you for that. Go ahead, Paul.
I just I guess I'm probably piling on with what Mike and Jack said, but we need more options. I'd love to see some of the intensive go into long rotation, and half's probably too much. I've been ranting and raving for 4 years about the financials. This thing needs to pay for itself, but it needs to provide information and direction for future decisions, and we've got to do some long rotation. If it's a quarter of the intensive, if it's an eighth, we need to be pursuing some of that, and it's going to cost us money in the short term, and it's going to make us money in the long term. I think there needs to be more balance. There needs to be something's got to go into extensive that's in intensive. It's pretty obvious that if you've got 11 to 9 or 11 to 10 that are one or the other, then it needs to be more balanced, and I think it needs to lean heavier to the extensive. That's what it's going to give us the answers that we want. We know how to do intensive forestry. We know that it's divisive, especially on public lands. So let's look at some other options. As far as those specific watersheds, Big Creek to me looks like it was misallocated as far as I'm concerned. It doesn't have the habitat, it doesn't have the age. It was misallocated. That line should be drawn on the west side, so it could be in the management area. And I would like to see it brought in as extensive at a minimum. Alder Creek, I think that was the northern portion. There might be some value to that. I'd like to see that brought in as long rotation, extensive, intensive or extensive. So East Hackey's is one that Bob and I went round and round and round on, and the solution we came up with probably isn't there, and that involves the other state lands that are in there, the hole in the donut that we kind of always ignore. But I think we need to bring it in and manage what we can, and probably best managed as extensive. So that's my 2 bits.
Thanks, Paul. Keith, and then Bob.
Yeah, I'm with, I think that Paul's point about the Big Creek area is right on. And with Alder Creek, I know that in the conversations we had with Ryan, or I had with Ryan, and I think Teresa was involved in those two when we were at Big K. I know there's some problems there that it's not quite a perfect fit, but all that can be done there, and I think is advised. And if Paul's point about longer rotation forestry there works, then I think that is also a good idea. But the question I posted on to all, and it wasn't really a hypothetical one at all. I was really looking for a shared expertise from Deanne and Melissa and Shannon and Ryan, and some advice. What is the solution here from your perspective, from your perspective about, and there's a balance there between research and practical on the ground experiences. Ryan, you know the forest really well, and so is there a concurrence of opinion in the four of you on how do we reach those goals? How do we do the protect habitat, and if buffers are part of that, or increased buffers are part of that, then how do we adequately fund a research platform that gets us started on our way to a world-class research forest? And maybe that's not it right out of the gate. Maybe it's, and we've all, I think, rationalized that. But that was the basis of my question. And I suppose that there's not an answer to be had from the four of you right now. But if I'm a prospective board member, and well, let me say it this way, in any board where I am a member, I'm looking for the best advice that I can find. And so that's my request. If I'm going to be a prospective board member, I'm going to look to some of you and say, is there a solution here that you can agree with, or that you can see, and then let us know what that looks like, if you could. I'm out.
Thanks, Keith. Who wants to take that one? Team, Brian?
I'll jump in first. Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted us to tackle this now or later, but yeah, briefly, kind of actually what I've heard, to me, the viable solutions are Big Creek and Alder Creek, and maybe a bit of Hackey. I think that probably disrupts the research design the least. It does get in the CRW, which could be problematic, but I think those are the two most viable areas to offset some of the potential impacts to buffering, and then also provides a little bit of relief on the financial end. So those are the places I think we should focus on.
Shannon, do you want to add anything to that?
I think the other piece of this, and I said this earlier, but that we're pursuing alongside of this is the take analysis, to look at the full range of mitigation that is provided under the HCP and under these layers that we're working with, as well as a take analysis based on the plan management, and see where we are. And, I think what Ryan identified, those are potential areas to look at, but that's the other piece of the puzzle that we need to really understand too.
Thanks, Shannon. Bob? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean, Deanne, you were going to weigh in there maybe.
I was, but I want to hear what Bob has to say first.
You sure?
Wise move.
I'm a little torn here. I like the idea of longer rotations on intensive and extensive. At the same time, I think based on the current allocations, OSU has the opportunity to do that. I mean, 65 years is a floor, not a ceiling. So you don't necessarily need to change in terms of the existing layout to go longer than that, at least for the purposes of the HCP. So I want us to be a little careful that we don't get too high centered on stuff when we have some really complex things that we got to fix in the next couple of days. but I am supportive of longer rotations. I'm not supportive of moving current reserves into longer rotations, just simply to create more flexibility. I think we went out and made a very, very big deal. In fact, you know, I remember OSU often leading presentations to the public with the idea of the 34,000 acre reserve and the largest reserve in the Coast Range. I remember legislators asking, you know, is this really secure? You know, is it really a reserve? And I remember us pushing back on a land trust saying, you know, they wanted to get that reserve kind of boxed up and saying, no, we didn't need that because it was locked in already. That was a commitment. And so, you know, I think we have a little bit of flexibility there. And I think particularly of the bucket approach where we need to potentially find some acres to make up some deficits on the other side of the forest. But I think we need to be very careful if we're really thinking about, you know, major shifts within the big reserve. Now you're up, Deanne.
Thanks, Bob. I just wanted to reiterate, I've been working on the marble roulette analysis, and it seems like something that we're just groping in the dark unless we have some way to evaluate where we are with respect to marble roulette habitat. So I think that's part of the piece moving forward. It's going to reduce some of the uncertainty moving forward, is to have a better idea of the effects of any alternatives that we consider on marble roulette. We call it a take analysis. It's really a habitat analysis. Take analysis sounds rather draconian. I don't like the word, but for lack of a better term, that's the one we're using. I wanted to say a little bit about long rotations. We've heard a lot about long rotations. I think they resolve a lot of problems just at the very simplistic level. If we move from a 60-year rotation to a 120-year rotation, we have half the edge impacts. We have half the costs of reforestation. You know, it goes all along those terms, all along that line of thought. The problem with moving to longer rotations is we don't have the age class distribution to do so right now in our harvest base. So how do we move to a longer rotation? And I've mentioned that the area control is one way to look at it. It's one way to think about it. But what happens is we end up, you know, if we're going to harvest something, we have to harvest what's on the forest now, not what's going to be in the forest in 120 years. So, but that results in a reduced harvest immediately and the resulting effect on financials. And if we are going to move to a longer rotation, I think there's great merit in it. But it's going to result in a financial hit in some way. We have to consider the financial cost of that. Also, just briefly to finish, we've talked about intensive and extensive as if they're two fundamentally different components. I really like Colin brought up at the retreat, you know, extensive forestry, and then I asked what retention, and he mentioned 10%, which is less than what we've been talking about. But I think there's great merit in that, because if we could have the benefits of long rotation forestry, and with 10% retention, that gives us flexibility to protect areas that are important to us. And it doesn't move a lot out of the harvest base, which is, you know, it's an important consideration when we're looking at financials. One of the issues with low retention forestry is, to many people, it's going to look like intensive forestry. I worked with Norm and Jerry when they were working on the ecological forestry demonstration projects with the BLM, and they found their names up on bulletin boards along I-5 for practicing intensive forestry in what they were demonstrating to be ecological forestry. So I just want to remind people that 10% retention or even 20% retention, it's retention forestry, may be called extensive, but it looks like a clear cut.
Okay, thanks. Paul? Paul, you're muted. Sorry.
There we go. How's that?
Better.
Some people cutting one tree is a clear cut, and they'll take a picture of it and post it on the internet from the right angle, and it looks like hell. So I don't. We're in this to create public license. We can't operate within the existing public license. We need to create new. Bob, there were a lot of commitments made. A lot of commitments. You know, that 34,000 acres that you're talking about as a commitment was a commitment based on everything else, that everything else would work, and that we would be allowed to put that off limits. It doesn't work. So you and I had a commitment on East Hackey, with conditions as they are. That commitment doesn't work. So we made a lot of commitments based on thinking that things would be a different way, and they aren't. And the other thing I want to point out is you're talking about buckets. I'm not talking about buckets with Big Creek and Alder Creek and East Hackey. I'm talking about bringing more into management, period. Because we need to, because it won't work unless we do. It's just that simple.
Bob, or Teresa, can one of you give your thoughts on that? Or other board members? Are you in the same place? So this is a pretty critical component of how we're thinking about problem solving here.
Well, I mean, I think, since you called on me, not to the degree Paul is, I think we passed legislation that made the management plan a foundational document. The legislation is a foundational document. We went on multiple tours and sold this to the public. And, I think we need to find solutions that limit the impacts as much as possible. And, I've heard Paul say it, I've heard Colin say it as well. If this is so far off the mark that we really can't deliver, then we've got a big problem at this point. We're way down the road. So yeah, we need to be flexible, and I think we left ourselves some room for flexibility in terms of moving some things around, and we should use that to its best effect. But I think we need to be careful when we talk about major pieces. So
thanks. Pete?
Yeah, I appreciate Bob's conversation and his input, and promises were, and we all toured around and we all spoke to a wide variety of groups, and because we remain advocates for the goal here. And I know that in the many times in the many groups I've spoken to, one of the things that came up was a target. It was a target harvest revenue to pay for the research, or that was part of the research, and that 17 million board feet goal is long gone, right? And I'm not. None of us are proposing we get back to that, but that was another one that was a promise made, and there were people on the South Coast and people in groups that I spoke to who found that something along those lines, and maybe not that figure exclusively, that was important to them too. And so Bob's exactly right. I mean, that conversations have been had. We've all been tremendous advocates for this. Those of us that have been around for the last 4 years or 4 decades, and and we did it because we were true believers. We did it because we want to see this succeed, and we see it in many ways as the last best hope to make on the Elliott in many regards. And I'm for finding that happy place where all these hard things find a way to balance each other out. And so I'm not speaking today or speaking right now to disagree with Bob. I agree with him. I agree that there have been assurances made or goals established, but they were in a lot of fronts too. And some of those other ones are currently not even close to what had originally been intended. And I think that's worth remembering as well.
Thanks, Keith. Brett, you had something?
Yeah, I'm just thinking about all this and wanting to throw something out there to try to drive towards seeing if you can all get on board. I mean, I guess I've heard over time, feels like the concerns exist around the self-sustainability of the forest that relates to the financial self-sustaining is in the Senate bill. Concerns exist around what to do about the murrelet conservation in the MRW. And Paul's kind of recognized, I remember at the retreat, like, okay, yeah, I get that we got to do something there. Don't know exactly what it is. And you've said what you said today, Paul, about buffering, which I think is helpful. And then on the other end, Bob, you've said it's offsetting any buffering impacts in the MRW with add backs in other parts of the forest is an easier place for you to get conceptually, and then just what I think a lot of the other Keith included board members have been talking about around let's have flexibility for harvest revenue essentially wherever we can get it, not just for offsets, but for broader financial viability purposes. And so Bob's flag, well, we sold this on certain commitments. Now we're thinking about ratcheting back. I guess I think about, like, there is time to keep talking about this, but there's less time in the context of, in my world, the thing that's most pressing is the HCP deadline. And I know that weighs on me, and I know it weighs on Melissa, Ryan, and everybody else at DSL. It's like, we gotta put something on the table and move forward. Otherwise we're off the timeline, and then a lot of things go off. So I guess I don't know where it is around what's too much around the add back end. Like the HCP is ultimately about assurances around conservation, but also within the realm of practicability and the financial viability end, and making sure that there's flexibility for certain, whatever the HCP does will determine if there is or if there's not flexibility. And so, I mean, my thought, it might be Bob, Teresa, thinking about the add backs. There are roughly 20, if you consider East Hackey, Upper Big Creek, and Alder Creek, you get to roughly 2,700 acres, a little more. And hold on, let me be sure I've got that right. $2,300 acres, a little more. A lot of those acres are in Alder Creek, and it feels like maybe there are portions of that Alder Creek area that are more problematic than others because they're more central to the core of the CRW where the restoration thinnings would be happening. But maybe there are portions of that Alder Creek area that are more on the outside that are more that are less than 65 and more palatable. And so, I mean, if it's I don't know what the number is, I guess, but if there's a number in the, somewhere less than 2,300 range in that affects the CRW or that affects, if the offset is roughly around the 902 buffer bucket from the MRW in the CRW, and I think that would largely be Upper Big Creek plus some of Alder Creek, and you get to the offset volume around, whatever the 902 is in MRW translated offset volume in CRW. And then that's all you do in the CRW, given the concerns around commitments in the CRW that have been made to the public. But you do some other things in East Hackey, for example, in the MRW partials, expanding, moving out along the lines of what we've talked about today, and where kind of Teresa signaled space, and potentially the MRW excess replicate. Those aren't CRW changes, but they still would add flexibility on the finances. And is that a place that folks could go if there's a commitment within the MRW Murelet conservation side too?
Keith?
Yeah, I use the same words I used 2 weeks ago. In terms of how we move forward to find the ground that we can all stand on, I'm agnostic in that process and where that ends up. That if Brad, if we can get there and then I'm in. If we're using Hackey Ridge or the what is it, Alder Creek and Big Creek, good, let's go. And if that gives us the financial stability to move forward and if that, not as an offset, but is simply a not as an offset for acreage lost, but is part of the process, then if that works, yeah, I mean, if that's the question you're asking, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's more detail on the other side of that, but yeah, that is like, what are we gonna do? I mean, DSL has to put something forward, so this is important to hear from you all.
And again, I'd like, I apologize, Mike, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, finish your thought there, Keith, and then Mike, and then Paul, and then we'll see if any other board members, and then I want to make sure we have time for public comment.
Okay, and then, and again, I'm going to go back to Ryan and Shannon and Deanne and Melissa. I would maybe individually, maybe I would greatly appreciate something from you that says this is because you guys have been listening to this entire conversation and our passion for getting the Elliott right, and you also know our concerns because we've been pretty clear about them. And if there's a discussion to be had amongst the four of you and whoever you think is appropriate, and say, hey, we think this is, and maybe that's what we're talking about right now, Brett, but this is what we think meets what we've heard and meets the forest needs and the research needs as well. So I would appreciate that.
Thanks, Keith. Mike, then Paul.
Yeah, I can agree with Upper Big Creek, Alder Creek, and East Hackey proposals. I have no problem with those. What I would like on the flip side, though, is if we went with that, what is the revenue that would come in? And then we would have to come up with a commitment that we live within that revenue, however that means. Obviously, it relates to how much research can be done, but ideally we build over time. If we move more towards longer rotations, but we got to live within our budget, which may obviously affect all that we can do, but that's the reality.
Thanks, Mike. Paul?
I think I'll just, I think I'll quit while I'm ahead or behind. I'm just gonna say the same thing over and over again, and I'm frankly, I'm getting kind of tired of saying it. You guys are probably getting tired of hearing it.
Thanks. I've got Jack and then Teresa.
I'll just kind of echo, I think, what Keith is saying. I'm sympathetic to keeping the reserve size as big as we can, but I think we've talked about some good options, and basically the OSU folks that have been looking at this for so long, and they've heard the back and forth from the prospective board members, and what's your best feel? What do you think is gonna get us there? Within this range of options that we've talked about today, and I'd love to see that.
Thanks, Jack. Teresa?
Yeah, can you hear me okay on the phone?
Yeah, we got you.
Okay. I think I'm not fundamentally opposed to taking some part of the CRW into management, as long as the old forest is reserved and the young forest is managed extensively, not intensively. But that being said, I think we need to really think about what we're bound to in the legislation on that end. And if we are doing that, what are we getting, basically, if you think about it, as far as the commitments that were made to conservation, what are we getting in exchange? So whether that means we're going to be adding some buffers where it's important on the occupied murrelet habitat, or using some higher retention extensive to connect more habitat where it's, like a lot of high value habitat in one area to create more connectivity across the landscape. I think that needs to be really clear. And then the second point, I just wanted to reiterate, I do think it's worth taking one, or I would say two of those extra intensive/reserve watershed allocations out of the research design, and having more flexibility with what we do in those younger stands. I think that could help with revenue and with some of the desires that people want to see. So that could be a larger discussion, but I think I sent some info to Brett on that, that maybe he could pass on to OSU.
Thanks, Teresa. And since we're close to having heard from most of the board, I want to just see, Colin, are you in a position to opine here on where your head's at? And then Bob and Jennifer, if you have anything.
Yeah, it seems like what we've been talking about is we're looking at some very discrete portions of the forest and talking about making some changes that are relatively minor in the grand scheme of things. But those minor changes would be changes to an overall allocation that's based on a financial analysis that was wrong, and very, very wrong, very off. And so I think we're going about this the wrong way. We're looking at making some very small changes to the existing allocation. I think what we need to be doing is looking at how much money do we need to fund a world-class research forest? How many acres do we need in management to realistically be able to provide that level of funding? And then what does that acreage look like on the map? It'd be really helpful to me to see it on the map, not just looking at individual discrete areas, but overall, what would the allocations on the Elliott look like? What would it need to look like in order to achieve the level of funding to meet the basic commitments that we set out to meet in the first place?
Thanks. Jennifer, anything from you? You're good. And Bob.
Jennifer, do you want to go?
She's
Thanks,
good.
Thanks, Bob. Go ahead.
Okay. Um, Yeah, this makes me pretty queasy. I think it is a very big shift. And I think it can potentially be explained and ameliorated to the degree that it does buy us flexibility on some of the issues we've talked about. But I'm not necessarily hearing that linkage. What I'm hearing more is this is a revenue generating thing. And I think if we tell the public that we're going into the conservation reserve because we want to cut trees because we need more revenue, I think that is a really fundamental deviation from the philosophy that has grounded this from the start. That's a big shift that I don't think is really acceptable at this late stage. I think to the degree that we're doing it because it gives us flexibility in terms of some of the issues we talked about earlier in the day regarding marble merlettes, and that those are locked in, that there's a quid pro quo, that it's clearly we're giving here and we're putting here. I think it's more palatable. I would reiterate too, though, that I think we need some big commitments, that some of them which may be binding. I do think we need to go back and look at the foundational documents, because we not only passed the legislation, but we locked in the management plan into that as well. So there may be legal issues here. I'm less, that's something for the lawyers to figure out. But I think if we can show that we're improving revenue, improving key ecological goals, that it's okay potentially. I think we should still be looking to minimize too, though. I think the bigger the sweeping changes we make at this point, the more likely we are to screw it up again. And, I think we need to use some humility here in the fact that we spent 4 years getting to this point, all this work, and now we're making some of the biggest changes we've made in the last 2 years, kind of on the last day. That's a recipe for really screwing things up down the road too, and losing public confidence. So I think the least we can do is probably the best we can do.
Thanks, Bob. Tom's not here. So let me quickly pivot to public comment, and I have Francis and then Peggy, and then we'll wrap up.
Hello.
Hi, Francis. We can hear you.
Okay, great. So I've been sitting here a little confused about all the sudden changes and all the options that are going on. When I read the Habitat Conservation Plan, I assumed that the Pacific Seabird Protocol was being used. I even thought I heard you say you were using the Pacific Seabird Protocol. And so to now find out that no buffers were put on, and the HCP was not clear that no buffers were being put on the trimas, it was kind of, I know you weren't trying to be sneaky, but from my point of view, sometimes here on the public, it seems like a sneaky move to not be really upfront that you weren't putting on the buffers. And now we learn that we're going to lose parts of our reserve, the 34,000 acre reserve. We could lose, what did I hear today, up to 2,500 acres of that reserve, because protecting merlets with buffers, you have to take away from other reserves. I'm just not happy about that whole thing. And I also heard today some resistance to surveying suitable habitat before projects that would degrade that habitat, that it's too expensive to survey for marble merlets before you do a timber sale there. Well, and it's so unclear. Don't you want to know what your impacts are of your projects? And you won't know that unless you do surveys beforehand. So if you aren't going to survey potential habitat before you do a timber sale, I think that needs to be made much more clear and have direct comments on that, and so, on top of surveying for merlets, don't you also have to survey for the coastal martin? I mean, the coastal martin is as important under the Endangered Species Act as marbled murrelets and spotted owls and the coho salmon. You just don't have an incidental take permit for martins. And so what's the impact of when you find martin habitat and when you find martins, because they're likely on the Elliott, the martins are likely there on the Elliott. And so we aren't going to find out until the forest management plan, what your survey protocol is going to be and what your mitigation is going to be for when you find.
Francis,
Yeah.
I just want to, can you maybe finish your thought there? And then I want to make sure there's time for Peggy, and then we've got a couple of next steps to tackle.
I am worried that we're going to lose more reserves. Every time you find a coastal martin, you're going to take it out of the reserves. And you shouldn't do that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Peggy?
Thank you. And thank you all for all the work that you're doing. I hear the struggles that you're going through. I simply want to remind you all where we sort of all really started back in 2015. There were protocols that came up related to whether or not when the state land board decided to sell the forest. And we pointed out at that time that even though there were a couple of losses in the Common School Fund, stock markets also have losses over time. But there seemed to be a push that that the Common School Fund must get rid of the Elliott State Forest. So as a part of the protocol, when it was first going to be sold, there were principles, there were criteria. And then there have been principles of the state land board since we have gone to this next step. So I hope that when you make your decisions that you take a look at those principles and those guidance. We spent a lot of time searching for an answer. We looked for conservation ownership, but 82,000 acres was a bit much for most groups. However, we did get the $100 million and we supported the $100 million. This was the first buy, to help buy the assets not otherwise protected by the ESA and any HCP. We supported the continuation of the HCP and that the HCP can be upheld in court and protects Oregon's iconic salmon, northern spotted owl, marbled murrelet, and others as they are recognized in attempting to survive, even thrive in this forest. And again, I keep reverting back to all of the documents that I have in my files. Treasurer Reed came up with the OSU Research Forest opportunity. And we worried from the beginning about governance and finance. And now we are getting to it. I just want to make sure that whatever decisions that you make related to the Elliott State Forest meet with what the public assumed would be this opportunity. And I hear you're struggling about it, but it is really important because the public has been involved since 2015. And so it's not as if we have not been paying attention to what's happening with the forest. And we do want you to be successful. But I am very concerned about what you're going to have to come up with in order to financially make this happen. I hope that there is a relook at the budget to see how much is absolutely needed to begin this experiment. Thanks for all your work. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Peggy. So next steps, just very quickly, I know we are out of time. Please fill out doodles for the upcoming meetings. And then Brett has a quick thought on advancing the conversation that he wanted to share.
Yeah, Peggy, thanks for paying. I feel like this is a grown zone that never ends on the Elliott, but grown zone usually leads to good outcomes. I guess my thoughts are this. By the time we have a June prospective board meeting, DSL is going to have to move forward with something, given the timeline, even with the December 31 adjustment. And so my thought is this was really helpful. I think we've gotten a good bit of feedback that we can, I think some of the vetting that needs to be done is within the balancing of the objectives around conservation, financial viability, and the research design. And so my thought is I can I have a sense of kind of a potential place to land and put it out there to you all as this is where DSL would head in the context of HCP changes. I want to do some talking it through first with the team internally before putting it out to you all, and that includes, ICF and Ryan, Bill, Vicky, the rest of our staff, and then OSU. But we also need to do a quick trap plan run with the services, which I think we can do relatively quickly, but get back to, and they can't be pre-decisional, but I think we need to run the lens around what impacts the potential changes have related to the aquatics, and also considerations around not wanting to restart the NEPA process with the scope of changes. So my thought is get something back to you with proposed direction and do it before the next meeting. And I think we'd have to, do it by email, that as a body. This is kind of an awkward space where you're advisory to TSL right now, but you're also the entity that one day will become the authority with vested legal authority and oversight of the forest and potentially, inheriting an HCP. So we're trying to keep it synced up, but I think we can get something very specific out of this with a little more internal vetting and then sent to you all for quick direct feedback, if that feels well. That's my thought, Peter.
Anybody have a problem with that idea? Off the top of your head, great. Thank you all for your time, much appreciated. We'll be in touch. Remember to fill out those doodles so we can get you a calendar for upcoming meetings. Thanks to the staff and team for all your work too. Really, really great.
Thanks for hosting, Peter.
Happy to have you. All right, see you.